now watching Way Back Wednesday, sponsored by Davenport Auto Park, the ride of your life. And also sponsored by Flores Glass, serving the area since 1977 with residential and commercial work.
Welcome to another episode of Way Back Wednesday. I'm Randy Adcock. So glad you could be with us. We're going to go back and revisit a couple of topics that we've talked about in previous shows. One last week and week before last too. We talked about spur tracks and how they were all over Rocky Mount. And I mentioned last week that I had a caller, a viewer, call me and ask about a spur track that used to go over the Tar River there. Just a little bit upstream from where the Sunset Avenue Bridge goes over Tar River there by Chico's, that area there, across from Sunset Park. And as a child, I remember hearing about a span of railroad track that went across the river there. And I also remember many, many years ago, I think I was traipsing around back there behind, the last business was there was Rocky Mountain Auto Parts and that Dixon Blind awning, that storefront there beside the river. Back behind that, back over behind the old boat club back up there, on the opposite bank of the river from the boat landing, there were some pilings over there that were the remnants of this old train track that went across the river there. And so I had a couple conversations with Eric in the past about this, and he came by the shop last week and we had a little discussion about it. He reminded me about that spur track that came across there, and it reminded me that it was actually, we had talked about it before, in fact, it was actually part of a spur that came off of the Tar River Lumber Company over where the old Rocky Mount Senior High School was. So anyway, that kind of got the gears turning in my mind. I said, well, I'm going to see, I wanted to find a picture, and I wanted to find out some more information about that particular spur track too. So that put me on a path to dig in that direction for tonight's show. And I found a couple things about Tar River Lumber Company in general. In fact, I found there were two entirely different, two separate businesses named Tar River Lumber Company. Ironically, they were both subjected to some of the same pitfalls of being in the lumber business, primarily burning to the ground on a couple of occasions. And we talked about that. I'm showing you some pictures of some fire and so forth. And also this week, I stumbled across some really interesting old maps. In fact, just today, many of you may know Coach A.B. Whitley, for a number of years was the coach of the Tarboro High School boys football team. He's one of my customers, and he came by today and I was looking at some old maps and we got to talking about Nash County in general. He's got a lot of knowledge of Nash County. He worked for many years for the federal government doing land surveys and so forth and land evaluations for building projects and different things. And so he's very familiar with Nash County, and so he was telling me about some soil maps, S-O-I-L. There's some old soil maps, and I found some of those online. He actually went home and got some discs and brought back so I could look at some of the ones he had. He's now retired, of course. But anyway, those maps are really neat. They show a lot of things that other maps don't show, topographical things, but they also show other things as well. So we're going to get to some of those too. Before we get into any of that, though, there was one thing we didn't get to last week that I wanted to make sure I touched on this week. We've talked many times about the 1863 Union run on Rocky Mount, where the Union troops came through here and destroyed Rocky Mount mills, among other things. And so that's been talked about many times on this show. And I ran across an article that appeared in the Rocky Mount Telegram many years ago. Actually, it was in the Nashville Graphic, I beg your pardon, it was in the Nashville Graphic. I think it came out in 1974. But it gave a description of Rocky Mount mills that I had never heard before. And so I just thought it was interesting, and it kind of put a vision in my mind that I never had of Rocky Mount mills. So I'm going to read this description to you and see if it doesn't put a different vision of Rocky Mount mills in your mind as well. First of all, just to kind of refresh on the history, it was July the 20th, 1863, the Union troops came into Rocky Mount. with a specific goal of demolishing and destroying anything that could be used for the war effort. And of course, top of that list was Rocky Mount Mills, because of the capabilities they had to make all kind of cloth and materials and so forth for the war effort for the Confederate troops. So anyway, they arrived in Rocky Mount early that morning, about 8:30 that morning, and began their task of literally destroying everything that could be of any use to anyone in a military environment. And then it goes on to talk about on their way to Rocky Mount Mills, everything that they destroyed on the way there. And then it says a mile or so from the west, to the west, they were talking about coming in from the east, of course, a mile or so to the west stood majestically at the falls on the Tar River a cotton mill, built of stone and 6 stories high. After evacuating the mill of 150 white girls, this was burned. Also in the storerooms of the mill was already manufactured staple cotton and manufactured goods. Moving back toward the burning depot, one government flouring mill, 4 stories tall, 1,000 barrels of flour, and immense quantities of hardtack. Hardtack is actually, there are recipes online now. You can go online and do a Google search for hardtack. It's considered a survival food. You can make it at home. It stores well. It's very nutritious, and it was a staple of early troops because it did store well and it was so easy to manufacture. But anyway, there were large quantities of hardtack, and they too were burned. It says the federal destruction continued on to a machine shop filled with war munitions and several separate warehouses. Fatigue that had previously hounded the cavalrymen was wearing off. Their duties now became less boring. 3 trains of government wagons loaded with all manner of stores and supplies fell into their hands. Several Confederate soldiers emerged and became prisoners of war. 35 wagons in all were collected for burning. The destruction of property was large and complete. So just kind of give you an overview there of the intent and the destruction that was wrought by the Union troops when they came into Rocky Mount. They were on a mission, of course, and their mission was to remove anything that could be used for the war effort. And so I was a little surprised. I had never seen that description of Rocky Mount Mills, particularly 6 stories high in one building, 4 stories high in another building, built of stone. The earliest pictures that I've seen of Rocky Mount Mills were when it was all wood. I've never seen a picture on the image of Rocky Mount Mills where any of it was stone until it became a brick mill many years after the Civil War. So I don't know what happened to all of the stonework that was there, but like I said, I had never seen that description, and it kind of startled me, frankly, that there was something that different than what I had in my mind as an image for Rocky Mount Mills. Okay, I mentioned that we'll talk a little bit tonight about the Tar River Lumber Company. And so when I started doing research for the Tar River Lumber Company, one of the first things I found was that there was more than one. And the first one was actually in Tarboro, and it predated the one that was here in Rocky Mount by several years. I went back as far as the late 1800s. And by the way, the one here started 1896, I think it was. We've got a little more history on that we'll get to a little bit. But before the one in Rocky Mount got started, there was a Tar River Lumber Company. I saw it also referred to in some cases as the Tar River Lumber Mill. But in any case, I saw multiple advertisements for Tar River Lumber Company located in Tarboro, North Carolina. So without further ado, Lee, let's put up item number 1 for our viewers, just to kind of give you an idea. These 2 businesses were very much similar. Obviously, they both took lumber and made usable wood products out of it. This ad appeared in the Carolina Banner, which was a Tarboro newspaper in the late 1800s. This ad appeared May the 9th of 1890. And you see there it says Tar River Mills sell lumber, dressed and undressed, pine, oak, cypress, and poplar, moldings, brackets, fancy work lathes, and I'm not sure what the little C stands for. Anyway, with new kiln-dried lumber can be had thoroughly seasoned. But you see there, located at the very bottom, located in Tarboro, North Carolina. And this, I'm not sure because the ad appeared May the 9th, but it says at the bottom, May the 3rd, 1890. But in any case, like I said, I saw several other ads that referred to it as Tar River Lumber Company, just like the one in Rocky Mount. But this one was in operation certainly by the, 1884, 85. So like I said, it predated the one in Rocky Mount by a couple years anyway. Okay, let's move on to number 2. December 31st of 1899, this article appeared, and it was actually in the News and Observer. And it's a fairly long, I'm just going to read the very top part of it because this was kind of an overview of Rocky Mount by the mayor at the time, who was Mr. T.T. Thorne. December 31st, 1899, Mayor Thorne had this to say about the Tar River Lumber Company here in Rocky Mount. He says, Tar River Lumber Company deniers in rough and dress lumber is another concern that is doing an immense business here with a future full of bright promise. Lumber is shipped by them to all parts of the country. A bandsaw with a cutting capacity of 40,000 feet is being put in. The tram road to Littleton in Halifax County, with place within reach of this mill, the large pine forest almost as yet untouched by Woodman's Act. So in 1899, there was already talk about a tram road leaving the mill, and in early instance, it was intended to go up to Littleton in Halifax County. That plan changed. We'll get to that in a minute, but this is 1899, and there was already plans. And the reason for this, if you think about it, the large outgrowths of timber, standing timber, the big hardwood forest, was some distance away from the city of Rocky Mount itself. And so to get those logs into the sawmill was itself a major undertaking. I can imagine, in fact, where there was no access to train tracks, there would be probably some mules and logging wagons, if you will, pulled by mules and brought in here that way. That had to be a cumbersome and tiresome and long job to get from a distant logging yard to the lumber yard for those logs to be cut up and made into board. So anyway, like I said, in 1899, Tar River Lumber Company of Rocky Mount was already in operation, and it was actually, there was plans to put a spur track up to Littleton in Halifax County. More on that in a minute. Okay, lead number 3. As I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, both Tar River Lumber Company in Rocky Mount and the one in Tarboro were subjected to fires on at least 2 different occasions. May of 1900, there was a massive fire in Tarboro. It says the entire plant of the old part of the Tar River lumber mills, including several 100,000 feet of lumber, were burned here this afternoon. The dry kiln and all the appurtenances belonging to it were also destroyed. Recently, a large addition, including an entire new plant, has been erected several hundred feet from the old plant. This was saved. The fire was first discovered between 6 and 7 o'clock after the mill hands had quit work for the day. The exact cause of the fire is not known. It is rumored that it caught from a match or a cigarette carelessly thrown into one of the oil cups near the engine. So luckily, this didn't burn the entire plant down, as was the case on a later date, and as was the case also in Rocky Mount on occasion. But in any case, like I said, this was quite common at lumber mills that, was sawdust everywhere, quite flammable, obviously, and then the whole structure being made of wood. There was oil from the machinery. Quite often there were smokers around. In the wintertime, I'm sure there were heaters and fires burning to keep warm, so the workers keep warm. So it was, you can imagine, it was really ripe for major fire to hit these places. And with all the wood and wood chips and sawdust literally all over the ground and everywhere else, it's no wonder they didn't just go up in flames almost immediately. Okay, lead number 4. There was a newspaper that I had never heard of before until getting ready for tonight's show and researching for this topic. And it was called, believe it or not, the Rocky Mount Motor. If you look at the very bottom of this article here, it's listed Rocky Mount Motor. Not motors, plural, but just singular, Rocky Mount Motor. And this is a neat little story about Mr. W.L. Groom, who actually was one of the principals and eventually the owner of Tar River Lumber Company here in Rocky Mount. And it's a little wonder, about 15 years of age, careworn, hungry, and seeking work not many days ago, came to the office of Mr. Groom at the Tar River Lumber Company. When asked about where he came from, the little fellow burst into tears and told all of a sad story of how he tired of home and ran away to see other parts of the country, and how disappointed he was in his rosy expectations, and how anxious to see his mother again. Mr. Groom knew what to do with such a little fellow. He simply housed and fed him and made arrangements to get him back to High Point, his home, again. The boy got home sound and well. His father for him has since written Mr. Groom thanking him for his kindness. This article appeared in the Rocky Mountain Motor newspaper July the 19th of 1900. Okay, and it kind of sets the stage for the story I'm going to tell a little bit about Mr. W.L. Groom. He was not only a very well-respected businessman, very astute businessman, by all indications, was a very well-liked individual too. I saw multiple references to him being praised as a fair-minded businessman, someone you could depend on, just a good fellow all the way around. Number 5, Lee, the Raleigh Times newspaper had this article appear April the 5th of 1905. You see there, $80,000 fire at Rocky Mount. The Tar River Lumber Company's plant and the ice factory were burned, the loss partly covered by insurance. It says fire originated about 3 o'clock p.m. in the dry kiln of the Tar River Lumber Company. The fire company was promptly on hand but could not check the flames. The loss of machine and lumber totaled $75,000. The insurance amounts to $25,000. The fire spread to the Rocky Mount Ice Company's plant, whose loss in machinery and stock was $30,000, which is largely covered by insurance. Several small tenant houses nearby were burned also. Now, another neat thing I learned about the Tar River Lumber Company, so after some of the discussions that Eric and I had in the past about this business, and the fact that it was located in what would in later years become Rocky Mount Senior High School location, over on there where Tillery Street and Nash Street and Hammond Street, where those streets surround this area. That's where Tar River Lumber Company was. And in my mind, I just automatically pictured the entrance to it being there on Nash Street, just like the entrance to Rocky Mount Senior High School. But I found out it was not. It actually had an address of Hammond Street. So the entrance to the Tar River Lumber Company, the main entrance for the public to use anyway, was from Hammond Street. We'll get more of that in a minute. Okay, number 6, Lee, in 1905 also, now keep in mind that fire was April the 5th of 1905. September the 6th of 1905, this rather long and detailed column appeared in the News and Observer, and it talks about the growing town of Rocky Mount. And I'm not going to read the whole thing because it is kind of long, but down near the bottom is one paragraph I wanted to share with you. Keep in mind, this is just a few short months, 5 months after that massive fire that destroyed a good part of the Tar River Lumber Company. It says here, the large new plant of the Tar River Lumber Company is rapidly nearing completion. This plant occupies a space of about 25 acres for buildings and yards. The company has surveyed and will very probably begin soon constructing a railroad from Rocky Mount to the Hilliardson section of Nash County, a distance of about 20 miles. So if you remember a minute ago, I mentioned that the original plan was to build a spur track from the plant up to Littleton in Halifax County. That plan was scrapped. The new plan was to build a spur track from Tar River Lumber Company in Rocky Mount up to Hilliardson to some logging areas up there. And this was in 1905. Okay, so I went looking again to see if I could find some indication of that spur track in place. I'll show you a map in a little bit of the actual spur track itself. But I just realized, looking at the clock, it's time for our first commercial break. So Lee, bring it back to me. When we come back from the break, we're going to show you a couple of maps and give you a really good indication of the route of that spur track, how it left the Tar River Lumber Company and made its way all the way up to Hilliardson. And so it's a neat passage there, how it goes through. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more Way Back Wednesday.
I'm Daniel Moss, owner of Cornerstone Funeral Home, and I'd like to invite you and your family to give our family an opportunity to serve you in your time of need. And we offer a full line of funeral services, everything from visitations to graveside services to cremations on site with a live crematory, as well as a banquet hall to meet the catering needs of our families that we serve. We offer catering service. We offer refreshments prior to visitations and services of our family. And we want to invite you to come and experience the difference here at Cornerstone Funeral Home.
There's a main nerve that leaves your back that goes into your hip and goes down your leg. It's called the sciatic nerve. A back injury can put pressure on that nerve, causing pain, numbness, tingling, Chiropractors can actually help that. At the Hammer Chiropractic Center on Sunset, we know exactly what to do. We have very good relationships with the doctors in Rocky Mount. We like to co-manage people's care. Some medications may help us do our jobs, and our jobs may help their medications work better.
And we're back. If you're just tuning in, folks, you're watching Wayback Wednesday. I'm Randy Adcox. Welcome to the broadcast tonight. We're talking about the Tar River Lumber Company, and we've talked this before. It's the spur track that left the Tar River Lumber Company and went up to Hilliardson has long since gone away. I've searched for hours and hours, tried to find some indication of some residual parts of that thing left somewhere. I do believe the pylons that held up the track as it came across Tar River on the opposite side of the boat ramp, I do believe they're still there in the woods. It's been many, many years since I was back there, but I don't know of any reason why they would have been taken down. They were pretty big, as I recall. I was a child when I last saw them, well, teenager anyway. But in any case, I believe they're probably still there. If you want to do, probably in the wintertime when all the greenery is off the trees and stuff, you could probably walk through the woods a bit to find them. But an interesting thing that we'll show you too, if you look on a map, an aerial map, especially of Rocky Mount, or you can go Google Earth or do Google Maps, there's a high power transmission line that runs kind of from that general area and goes right. If you stand there across the river, you can look and see where those power lines go. They run up behind the old Kmart shopping center. They go across 301 down there, and they kind of turn and head up toward Golden East Mall. It's my firm belief that that was the original track of that spur track. And the reason I say that is when you look at the maps that do show that spur track, it looks to me to be that same general path that those high power transmission lines take. I rode by 301 today, in fact, and you can see if you're there in the general area where the IHOP restaurant is. You can look over, if you're headed south on 301, you can look over to your left and you can see there's a cut line there over toward the river and across the river where those lines go there. And if you look back, you can see where they cross over and then cross over 64 bypass and then continue on. But I believe that's the general path of that spur track. Okay, I mentioned a map. I went looking for pictures, maps, anything that would show the spur track. Well, the first map I came across was from 1911, and number 7, if you would, Lee. And this is actually just a Nash County map from 1911, and it didn't show the spur track. It did show the main line, if you will, running from Rocky Mount over towards Spring Hope. And you remember from last week's show, we talked about there was some surprise that I found that eventually that Spring Hope section did go on to Raleigh, but in 1911 apparently it did not. You see that it looked like it stopped there in Spring Hope. But this map didn't show anything about the spur track going up toward Hilliardson. So, and you see Hilliarson's on the map, so I thought, well, that's odd, the Hilliarson's there, but there's no spur track. So my first thought was, okay, well in 1911 the spur track wasn't there yet. Okay, so then I kept doing some more digging and I stumbled across a book, and I dare say no one in Rocky Mount has probably got this book except maybe the library. I've not been to see if they've got a copy there. But there is a really neat book that came out in 1911, and it's called, the title of the book is Rocky Mount, the Gateway of Eastern North Carolina. I'll show you in a minute a picture of the front of that book. At least I think it's the front. I'm not even sure because what I found online was a digitized version, and it was missing the first 6 or 8 pages of the book. Well, first 6, I think. First 6 pages were missing. The front cover was obviously missing. The back part was missing. So this was a project was done many, many years ago by the UNC, the Wilson Library up at UNC, I think it was, that digitized this pieces of book they found. But it's got some really neat information in it, and there's a great article right here on the Tar River Lumber Company. And this article appeared, this book was published by the Rocky Mount Record, which was one of the newspapers in Rocky Mount in 1911. The Rocky Mount Record published this book. And it's a real good story here. I'm going to read about the Tar River Lumber Company. It says, among the industries that have contributed to the upbuilding and progress of Rocky Mount and this section, the Tar River Lumber Company is easily one of the greatest and most potent. This company's plant is at present one of the most complete and modern equipped lumber plants in the South. It has a capacity of 40,000 feet in 10 hours, and by reason of the perfect arrangement of the buildings and machinery, together with a management that for excellence of system and entire efficiency is scarcely equaled in the country, the plant is able to convert timber into furnished lumber at a minimum cost. The present plan of the Tar River Lumber Company is located the present plant of the Tar River Lumber Company is located just on the outskirts of Rocky Mount on the Nashville branch of the Atlantic Coastline Railroad. It consists of the latest improved bandsaw mill, the building being 36 by 132, a planing mill 72 by 132, which includes a bandsaw with a capacity of 50,000 feet per day for turning out flooring, ceiling, weatherboarding, and finished lumber of all kinds. A trim mill 48 by 144 in feet, which is power. So the company has a railroad running from this mill in a northwesterly direction through Nash County, which penetrates their timber properties and hauls logs to the mill. As a matter of accommodation to the people who live along the line, this railroad, while not a common carrier, has been hauling several thousand tons of fertilizer annually. It is the purpose of Mr. Groom, the president and general manager of the company, and whatever he proposes to carry both freight and passengers, the benefits will accrue to the people of that section of Nash County traversed by this railroad will be incalculable. So by 1911, the spur track was in fact already in place, and not only was it being used to haul lumber, it was used to haul fertilizer. There were people living along the spur track and houses and so forth, and so it was actually being used to transport people to and from the sawmill area up to Houston and back and forth too. There's no mention of whether or not they had to pay anything to ride on the train, but his intention, certainly, according to this anyway, was to open the train up for more public transportation in the future. And again, this is 1911. So by 1911, we know the spur track was in place, it was in use, it was already bringing logs in from Houston down to the plant here in Rocky Mount. And it was also bringing fertilizer to and from the area. And so it was being used for more than just hauling lumber. As I said, this book was called Rocky Mount, the Gateway of Eastern North Carolina. If anybody sees a copy of that book anywhere, please let me know. I looked online. There was a reprint, supposedly, of that that book that came out sometime around, I think, 2016 or 2017. But I'm just a little bit leery of purchasing the book because I'm not entirely certain it's the same one. I've not seen a picture of the front of this book, of course, or at least not that I'm sure of. I've seen a picture, but it may or may not be the right front. So anyway, moving on, Lee, number 9, in this same book, this same publication, was this picture of Mr. W.L. Groom, and again, it's from 1911. And we can go on to Lee, number 10 as well. And this was his residence. He lived at 226 Franklin Street in 1911. And I can imagine this was a fine and stately home. It says here, Rocky Mount is famed for its beautiful and commodious residences. It is truly a city of homes. The residence of Mr. W.L. Groom here shown is a wonder in convenience and comfort. The plans for the residence were drawn by Mr. and Ms. Groom themselves, carrying out their own ideas of a model arrangement. And of course, sadly, this home is long gone. It would have been in the 200 block of Franklin Street, which is, of course, all business and commercial property now. No more residences in this area. But it was a fine home in its day, I'm sure. And lastly of this book, I found this image, number 11, if you would, Lee. And again, I'm not certain that this is the actual front cover of the book. It could be someone's idea of what it may have looked like. But I do know the correct title is here, Rocky Mount, the Gateway of Eastern North Carolina. And you see at the top, it says Rocky Mount Record. That was the newspaper at the time, one of our local newspapers anyway, and they published this book. I feel like there may be a copy of this in the Rocky Mount Public Library. In fact, I think I've seen a copy of it. But I would love to have my own copy. So if anyone knows anything about this book, if you see one anywhere, If you want any folks to go around and go to bookstores and look at old books, you have to, keep in mind this book could be 13 years old now. So any copy that's still out there is probably tattered and worn and all the pieces, but I would surely love to have a copy of it. It's just got some really neat information. I downloaded as much of the book as I could download from this website I found. Well, actually it's the Wilson Library, I think is where I found it at. But it's not complete. And it was 262 pages in the book, I think, originally. And it's missing quite a bit of that. So anyway, all right, let's move on to number 12. February the 6th, 1913, this article appeared in the Nashville Graphic. And, it talks about, I'm not going to read the whole thing, just the very bottom here is all that really pertains to what we're talking about tonight. And it says, a wreck occurred on the road of the Tar River Lumber Company a few days ago when the locomotive left the rails and almost turned completely over, in which position it remained until placed upon the track about 24 hours later. Fortunately, no one was hurt. So there you go. There was also, in addition to the track itself, the spur track, there was a road that ran along beside the track. Now, this is obviously talking about the train track itself. The train wouldn't have been on the road. But there was a road that ran along beside the train track for purposes of servicing the track, doing repairs and so forth. And so it was along that road that there were houses. People were living along that spur track between here and Houston. And so there was even a little camp up just outside of Houston where the loggers lived, and they stayed up there close to the logging logging forest, of course, to be able to be close to work. And I'm sure many of them probably lived a good part of their lives there. So it was like a little cottage industry, I guess is what I'm getting at. The spur track itself being in place for the benefit of the sawmill, of the lumber mill here in Rocky Mount, created employment for people all up and down the sawmill path, the spur track path, and certainly for the people up in that area who were loggers up there. I'm sure it provided probably decent wages for what was being paid for wages in the early 1900s anyway. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that these types of operations were certainly prone to fire. It was just almost a guarantee. If you're in this kind of business, you were going to have to deal with some fire at some point. The plant had already burned one time, and Mr. Groom rebuilt it. Sadly, May the 16th, almost to the day, it'll be tomorrow now, in 1916, yet another fire hit Tar River Lumber Company. Number 13, if you would, Lee. This article appeared in the News and Record newspaper. Like I said, May 16th of 1916, and it's kind of a long article. I'm just going to kind of hit the highlights here. It says, upwards of $25,000 fire loss attended the destruction early this morning of the sawmill plant of the Tar River Lumber Company and gave to this city the heaviest single fire loss in more than 4 years. The mammoth sawmill plant of this company, which was of 40,000 feet capacity per day, was one of the largest in the state, while the engines, pumps, etc., which supplied nearby dry kilns, were totally wrecked. The flames, which started in the boiler room of the plant, caused a call for the Central Department at 2:15 this morning, while 15 minutes later there followed a call for all departments in the city. This general alarm attracting hundreds to the scene, many of whom watched the firefighters battle with flames until well after daybreak this morning. And it goes on to say, the firemen, though successfully preventing a spread of the flames to other nearby structures and departments of the plant, were materially handicapped by an inadequate pressure occasioned by a small private line and hydrant, and it was not until the steam fire engine was brought into play that the firemen put in effective strokes. So once again, the Tar River Lumber Company was destroyed by fire. Once in 1905, I think we said earlier, here again in 1916. And to his credit, Mr. Groom was a man that did not give up. He did not let this deter him. He goes on to say, this is the second heavy fire loss according to Tar River Lumber Company. They haven't had their entire plant wiped out by flames in 1905. W.L. Groom of this city is president and general manager, and Howie Baker of Elmira, New York is treasurer. So once again, fire hits. Now, that was May the 16th of 1916. 2 days later, the National Graphic had this story in their paper, number 14, if you would, Lee. And it just says, Rocky Mount suffered a serious fire loss this week when the mammoth plant of Tar River Lumber Company was almost totally destroyed, entailing a loss of nearly $100,000, which is partly covered by insurance. The fire originated in the boiler room. Already, President Groom is making plans to rebuild the plant even on a more gigantic scale. Not many businessmen would go through two major fires and then be looking at rebuilding a third time. But that says something about the type of man and character of the man who was at the helm of Tar River Lumber Company. He took it in stride. He was in a business that was certainly subjected to the possibility of being able to be burned down. And in fact, it happened at least twice that we know of. But yet, determination held up and he rebuilt again. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that I was looking for pictures of the spur track, and I've scoured the web. I've scoured all the little books I've got on my little miniature library there in my office. I have yet to find a picture itself of any of this spur track. I would love this to run. Oh, we got a call. Let's get a call. Hello, caller, you on the air?
All right. From what I understand, Mr. W.L. Groom, when he came to Rocky Mount, he was a young adult from upstate New York, and his daddy before him was a lumberman up there in upstate New York.
That's right.
Anything ever happened here in Rocky Mount at the helm of his son, W.L. Groom.
Mm-hmm.
All right?
All right, buddy. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. Okay. So as I said, I scoured the web. I scoured through books I've got. I have looked in earnest, tried to find some remaining aspect of that spur track. I got to believe somewhere there's a piece of that track still laying somewhere in the woods, forgotten for decades. But so far I have not found it. I'll keep looking. But what I did find was some really interesting maps. One being the 1918 map of Nash County, number 15 if you would, Lee. This is a really detailed map. Eric and I have talked about it a couple times. And Lee, you can zoom in until you start seeing that yellow line kind of in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. It goes from about midway on the right-hand side, and you'll see when you zoom in. But I actually found the path of that spur track and traced it out on this map. And we'll get Lee to zoom in here for us just a minute. Bear with us here. It's a very detailed map. I was really shocked at the detail this map has. You can really zoom right in on it, and there's all kind of things, revelations that could be revealed by looking at this kind of map here. There you go. Okay. All right, Lee, kind of pan down a little bit. You see the yellow line there running midway through your screen. Okay, come down a little bit more. Now follow the yellow line downward. You see where it comes through Dorches there, to the Red Oak area. And if you follow it on down, you see it goes down there through what's referred to as the Stony Creek Township. Okay, there you go, right there where it says Rocky Mount. If you zoom in on that area, Lee, right there where it says Rocky Mount and the yellow line starts there, that actually is the location where the Tar River Lumber Company was located in 1896 when it got started. And actually, as I said earlier, my thinking was because, Eric and I talked about it being there in the general location of where Rocky Mount Senior High School would later be built. I just assumed that the entrance to the plant itself, the lumber plant, would be there on Nash Street. But it wasn't. I found actually that the entrance to it would have been from Hammond Street. And so if you think about how the railroad track runs by there, people who wanted to go into the lumber plant to purchase lumber or whatever would literally have to cross the railroad track to get to the lumber plant. But that's the way it was. And there were several outbuildings, of course, that were part of the operation. So Lee, okay, let's just kind of follow along now, kind of pan your way up and follow that yellow line that we've got outlined there. And you can see, as I said, it goes up, kind of cuts across, goes up toward Dorches, just a little bit north of Dorches. It crosses over Halifax Road, not too far from my house. You follow the line on up, it goes up a little just north and west of Red Oak, and it goes on up, and you see there, up in your upper left-hand corner, it says Tar River Lumber Company Camp. That's where the loggers had their camp. And the logging spur track itself went on up another mile or so northwest of where the camp was. But there were houses there. There were cabins, I guess would be probably a better way to describe them. But anyway, that's where the loggers stayed. That's where they were based out of, if you will. And so, if you look along that spur track, it looks like it's not a whole lot. Certainly, it's a fairly remote area. But there were actually houses and farms and people who kind of were in close enough proximity to that spur track to hitch a ride on it, if you will. I'm sure there were some occasions where Mr. Groom allowed people to ship any number of items on his spur track, providing there was space available on an empty car, maybe, for example, or a freight car. So it's a shame that none of it's there now, because I'm sure it was a boon to that area during the time it was in operation. But again, it's no longer there. And I do believe, Lee, aren't we time for another commercial break? I just looked at the clock again. So let's go ahead and take that break. When we come back, I'm going to show you another map or so, talk a little bit more about Mr. Groom himself and his other dealings and accomplishments. So hang in there, folks. We'll be right back with more Way Back Wednesday.
I'm Daniel Moss, owner of Cornerstone Funeral Home, and I'd like to invite you and your family to give our family an opportunity to serve you in your time of need. And we offer a full line of funeral services, everything from visitations to graveside services to cremations on site with a live crematory, as well as a banquet hall to meet the catering needs of our families that we serve. We offer catering service. We offer refreshments prior to visitations and services of our family. And we want to invite you to come and experience the difference here at Cornerstone Funeral Home.
There's a main nerve that leaves your back that goes into your hip and goes down your leg. It's called the sciatic nerve. A back injury can put pressure on that nerve, causing pain, numbness, tingling. Chiropractors can actually help that. At the Hammer Chiropractic Center on Sunset, we know exactly what to do. We have very good relationships with the doctors in Rocky Mount. We like to co-manage people's care. Some medications may help us do our jobs, and our jobs may help their medications work better.
And we are back. We are back. I mentioned Mr. A.B. Whitley came into my shop today, and he was telling me about these soil maps. And if I'd ever seen one before, I didn't remember it. But in his job capacity, working for the government for many, many years, he had occasion to use these soil maps on a regular basis. And so I immediately went doing some digging and doing some Google searches, and I found such a map from 1926. And these are fairly interesting maps because, number one, they're in color, which is rare for something that old. It's not a photograph. And honestly, I don't know for sure. They're aerial maps, so someone in a plane or a hot air balloon or something must have flew over Nash County and did these maps, created these maps. But Lee, if you would, put up item number 16 for our viewers. I just want to kind of give you an idea of what a soil map looks like. And it really just, it identifies, oh, we got a call, let's get a call. Hello, caller, you're on the air.
Yes, I like your shirt, man. You got a very colorful shirt on there tonight.
Well, thank you, sir. This is my, I'm almost in Hawaii shirt.
Going almost in Hawaii. Have you ever been to Hawaii?
Actually, I have. Many years ago, I did fly in and out of there when I was in the Navy. I didn't get to see as much, I spent a lot of time there to see much, but I had been there.
Yeah, but I just wanted to comment on your shirt, man.
Well, thank you, buddy. I appreciate that.
You stand out tonight, boy.
Well, thank you. Have a good evening.
All right.
Bye-bye. Okay. All right. So, again, this is a soil map. And over on the left-hand side, it identifies the different types of soil. There's sandy, loam, and even it identifies areas that are swampland, where there might be standing water or occasional standing water. It's a really neat map. And the spur track is actually identified on this map as well. We don't have to zoom in on this one, Lee. I just want to kind of give the viewers an idea that these maps do exist. So if you're interested in such things, you can look. They make these maps for every county. There's one for Edgecombe County too. I just pulled it for Nash County. But and they're available for various years. I was really surprised. This map here is from 1926, and so again, I have no idea how it was made. There was airplanes flying in 1926, and so it may be that the state contracted a crop duster pile or something. Maybe, who knows? The military could have been involved for that matter. But in any case, this is an aerial map from 1926, and they've actually done a really good job of identifying. If you do zoom in, you can actually see structures and buildings and everything that are identified. So anyway, all right, let's move on to number 17. September the 1st, 1927, this ad appeared in the Nashville Graphic, and you see there a real buy, kiln-dried flooring and ceiling at $18. Best bargain yet for ceiling and flooring tenant houses. We also furnish everything to build with, have a big stock on hand. Tall River Lumber Company, and you see the address at the bottom, West Hammond Street. And again, that was surprising to me. In my mind, I had a vision of this place being on Nash Street with an entrance from Nash Street, and I was really surprised to see that it had a West Hammond Street address. And again, if you're over that way, and if you know where Talbot Drive Shell used to be and the backside of Rocky Mount Senior High School, that railroad track comes right across there, so you'd have had to cross the railroad track to go into the plant there to buy wood. But I mean, I guess it didn't matter. It was all at grade level anyway, so you just drive over the railroad tracks and pull your truck up there and get the lumber. Okay, I mentioned Mr. Groom was a businessman, a very astute businessman, a well-respected businessman, and was involved in several businesses around town. And one such business was the First National Bank of Rocky Mount. Number 18, Lee. January the 6th of 1929. Now, if that rings a bell with you, it should. That was the year the stock market crashed, of course. And stories I've read and things I've read about the First National Bank of Rocky Mount was that was one of the things that caused that bank to go under, the stock market crash in 1929. But on the right-hand side there, on the board of directors, down there at the bottom, is listed Mr. W.L. Groom of the Tall River Lumber Company. And he was just one of, about a dozen or so different members of the board of directors. And I saw his name involved with other things as well. He was actually, let's move on, lead to number 9. This also appeared in the Nashville Graphic, March 31st of 1932. And I'm just going to read this one paragraph because this is interesting. The rest of it really doesn't apply. But it says, containing 43.75 acres, more or less, having such shapes, courses, and distances will more fully appear by reference to a plat thereof made by B.J. Downey, engineer, October 1922, a copy of which is attached to the extract now on file with the Federal Land Bank of Columbia, the same being bound on the north side by Mary Gay Tract, on the east by the lands of T.B. Dameron, on the south by the lands of R.E. Johnson, and on the west by the lands of the Tall River Lumber Company, the Man-Arrington Gold Mine Company tract. So in addition to being involved in the lumber business and the banking business, Mr. W.L. Groom was also involved with the Man-Arrington Gold Mine tract, also later known as the Argo Mine. And so I found that interesting, and I wonder now how much gold was transported on that spur track between Hilliardson area up there. If you look on the map, it's not too terribly far from the Argo Mine to Hilliardson in that area. So I don't know that he was involved specifically with mining gold, but he was certainly at least involved with some land that was in that gold mine area. Okay, all right, let's move on to number 20, Lee. November the 1st, 1939, this article appeared in the Rocky Mount Telegram. Now, it talks about plans for a new park on site beside Tar River, as the headline reads. It says, the city today received a green light for its plans to develop a riverside park east of the waterworks when a telegram from Representative Harold Cooley arrived here announcing that Rocky Mount's application for a WPA grant of over $8,000 had been approved. The telegram from the Nashville congressman stated that the local project would receive $8,073 from the government. L.B. Aycock, the city manager who received the communication, said that the grant would be in the form of labor and certain materials. The city will add about $6,000 in materials and services to the federal grant. Okay, so the plan here is the city of Rocky Mount to build a new park beside Tar River. Okay, this was the first page of the article, but it was continued on page 9. So Lee, let's go to item number 21, which is the remaining part of this article. And it says, the old iron bridge that used to cross the Tar River near where the new park is has been removed. The bridge once belonged to the Tar River Lumber Company and was part of a small train road used for carrying lumber. Its lines, removed a long time ago, went through the middle of the present park. So that tram, that spur track, went right through the middle of Sunset Park. It says first action to secure a park on the river was taken last spring when a 60-day option was taken on the property. When a new budget was formed, a $3,000 item was inserted to provide for its purchase. The land extends east of the waterworks to Taylor Street Extension. So in order to put Sunset Park in place, apparently in 1939, well, it doesn't say exactly when, just prior to 1939, the remaining portions of the spur track for the Tar River Lumber Company had been removed. And so that begs the question, if it went into existence somewhere around 1910, 1911, because we know in 1911 when the Rocky Mount Record published that book, it was already in use then, in 1911. By 1939, it was no longer in use. In fact, there was the segment that went through Sunset Park had been taken down. I'm sure that the segment across Tar River had also been taken down. So there's only a span of a little over 20 years there when that tram was in use, that spur track was in use by the lumber company. So there's still a bit of a mystery as to when it ceased to be in use and when it ceased to be in operation. But we'll move on, Lee. Let's go to number 22. 1941, May the 25th, 1941, this notice of sale of property on the Tar River Lumber Company appeared in the News and Observer. And it says, pursuant to order rendered in an action now pending in Superior Court of Nash County entitled People's Bank and Trust Company, General Guardian of W.L. Groom versus the Tar River Lumber Company, the undersigned receivers will on Wednesday, June 25th, 1941, beginning at 10 o'clock a.m., offer for sale at public auction for cash at the place of business of the Tar River Lumber Company in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, the stock in trade, machinery, fixtures, mill, and mill site of the Tar River Lumber Company, including all lumber, logs, planing mill machinery and equipment, trim mill machinery and equipment, and saw mill machinery and equipment, and approximately 19 acres of land upon which the plant is located. The various properties offered will be offered for sale separately in groups and as a whole, full details of which will be announced at the sale. An itemized inventory of the property may be seen at the plant or at the offices of the undersigned receivers in Rocky Mount. The receivers were J.P. Bunn and W.L. Thorpe. So I'm not exactly sure what happened. I've not been able to find any specific reference to anything that caused this action. But in 1941, the property was put up for sale for cash to be bought, the entire operation. So that was May the 25th of 1941. By April the 11th of 1942, lead number 23 if you would, this ad appeared in the Rocky Mount Telegram, April the 11th, 1942. We buy standing timber and logs, Anderson Lumber Company, successors to the Tar River Lumber Company. So by 1942, Mr. Anderson had purchased the former location and business of Tar River Lumber Company and was now running it as Anderson Lumber Company. Okay, let's move on. Lead number 24. This article appeared in the News and Observer September 21st of 1944. And it's kind of a follow-up article. Now keep in mind, by 1944, Tar River Lumber Company has been sold. Mr. Anderson now owns it, and he's got it and operating as Anderson Lumber Company. It says, for the second time, the High Court remanded to Nash County. Oh, we got a call. Let's get this call. Hello, caller. You're on the air.
All right. That Anderson name you just spoke about that came into the ownership of the previous Tar River Lumber Company, his initials were S.T. Anderson. The T stood for Tilden, T-I-L-D-O-N, I think. Tilden Anderson became into owning that property and that operation at the time you're just speaking of.
Right. That's right. That was the next article I was getting to, was Mr. S.T. Anderson.
Goodbye.
Okay, buddy, thank you. So, number 24, there you go. For the second time, the High Court remanded to the Nash County Superior Court a case in which S.T. Anderson appealed from a lower court order allowing the claim of the People's Bank and Trust Company, guardian and administrator of W.L. Groom, amounting to $87,000 from receivers of the Tar River Lumber Company. Anderson had filed a claim for $8,500 against the lumber company. The case previously was remanded by the Supreme Court, for further consideration by the Nash County Court of a motion by Anderson. So apparently, I'm not sure what happened. There was certainly some kind of disagreement between Mr. Anderson and Mr. Chrome. There was a fire, that was in 1944. This picture you're looking at here now was December 13th, 1950, and this was yet another fire that occurred at the former location of the Tar River Lumber Company. By this time, it was S.T. Anderson who owned the company, but this fire occurred December 13th, 1950. Number 26, Lee, you see the article headline, Fire Destroys Mill Property, a fire which defied efforts of local firemen battling in freezing weather raged for several hours last night in the Anderson Lumber Company here, causing damage which the owners today said was difficult to estimate. Listen to this. W. Carlton Noel and Anderson Lumber Company, owners of the property, said that the loss approximated $15,000, although it would cost many times that much to replace it. I never knew Carlton Noel was a partner in Anderson Lumber Company until I read this article, but he was. Okay, let's go ahead and lead number 27. Fire wrecks building here in 1957. All right, now by now Rocky Mount Senior High has been built. It was built in 1953, so by 57, Senior High is there. The lumber mill is gone, but there were some outbuildings that were still on the property that used to be part of the mill. And they burned. 1957, those buildings burned. It was just a bad place to have anything that would burn, apparently. Number 28, Lee, we're almost out of time here. This was the fire that happened the very next year at another outbuilding, October 5th, 1958. Yet another fire that appeared on the former location of Tar River Lumber Company. It was just amazing. And lastly, I will get to one more before we go off the air for tonight. Just a little do you know. Tar River Lumber Company was located between South Rocky Mount and Rocky Mount on the main line, Atlantic Coast Line. L.O. Parrish was the founder. How about that? In 1897, W.L. Groom, J.H. Harris, and Howard E. Baker bought the plant. Groom became manager. A number of farmers cleared their farms and mortgages by selling timber to Tar River Lumber Company. The plant was burned on April 4th, 1905, and of course it burned many times after that as well. We've got time for one last call, I think. Hello, caller. Hello, you on the air? Oh, I think it was Eric. Eric, call me back after the show. Folks, we've run slam out of time. That's all the time we've got for tonight. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank those that called in and shared your memories with us. We appreciate that. We'll see you next week with more Way Back Wednesday. Have a good night. Take care of yourselves and be kind to one another. Bye-bye.